Would you believe it if I told you that we have almost no idea what Frederick the Great actually looked like? That's right. Every single portrait you've ever seen of old Fritz is a lie. I'm talking about this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. All of them are a lie. I'll explain. Imagine you are a portrait painter in the 18th century, and you trained in one of the great workshops in Flanders or Milan or somewhere, and you're hired to paint the portrait of the king of so-and-so. So you need to paint this lord or lady with enough fidelity for them to be instantly recognizable. But this isn't just a face we're talking about, because this person is standing at the top of an unshakable pyramid of power, looking down at all of us peasants. And so your portrait needs to portray not only a face, but also the vast leviathan of the ancien regime. You need to paint a totemic icon, a symbolic stand-in for the justice, order, and terrifying violence that this person wields.
Don't f*** it up.
And this puts your portrait at cross purposes, because everybody knows that this king has a drinking problem and is missing half their teeth, and routinely hosts orgies that would put Diddy to shame. But none of this can go into your official portrait. So you lie, and your portrait lies. Or at least it bends the truth, airbrushing out smallpox scars and lazy eyes and any other unpleasant disfigurements. But maybe you go further, and maybe the portrait that you paint has almost no connection with the real person. I'm that Habsburg map guy, and this is a story about beauty, about aristocratic representation, about truth and lies. It's also a tale of two sovereigns, two rulers who were iconic in their era, who absolutely hated each other, and who were very much polar opposites. Maria Theresia, the Habsburg Queen of Austria, and Frederick the Great of Prussia. As we'll see, one used portraits to fabricate a political legitimacy, and the other erased his face from history. In an age before photography, royal portraits were more than likenesses. They were tools of diplomacy, marriage, legitimacy, and myth-making. And they told a story, not just of a person, but what that person represented. And this can be extremely powerful. So a few months ago, I made a video about Habsburg inbreeding. And in the video, I commented on the odd trend where the Habsburg inbred girls are much more beautiful than the sort of lumpen-looking Habsburg boys. And one of the comments was that the artists who were commissioned to make these portraits were beautifying the pictures of the girls to make them more marriageable. And this makes sense. In an extremely patriarchal system where men have all of the power, the value of women and of girls is reduced to their attractiveness. But my default reaction is always skepticism. And this question got me thinking. Were all of these portraits lying? And how would that even work? I mean, presumably a princess would go off to a foreign court. But if she looked considerably different than her portrait, I would sort of expect that the prince might feel a little bit catfished. And what about family resemblances? Or the tons of portraits of aristocratic women who are frankly kind of unattractive? So I feel like the first thing that we need to make clear is that beauty is subjective, obviously. I got in a little bit of trouble from viewers for the comments that I was making, objectifying the girls. For convenience, from this point on, I'm calling Maria the hot one, and Elizabeth the nice one. Spoiler, I don't really care. They were all bad people. Anyway, as a baseline, I think that we can say that beauty, attractiveness, correlates very strongly with wealth and power. So for example, back in university, I studied abroad in Oxford for like a semester. And although it was genuinely one of the worst experiences of my life, it's a terrible, terrible place. Don't go to Oxford, just my perspective. It was really an eye-opening experience to see the way that class works, aristocracy still works in the UK. As soon as I left Oxford, I started backpacking around the country. The people got so much nicer, much more open, much more friendly, but also the standard of beauty, at least my perspective was that the average level of beauty declined by a lot. I think a lot of the reason we're fascinated by ugly, deformed nobility is because it challenges our expectations about the way things should be, the way we imagine the beautiful princess, for example. And another baseline is that because beauty standards change over time, it's very difficult to say what average actually means. So a very clear example of this is the fact that if the vast majority of humanity works in the fields under the hot sun all day long, all their lives, just having clear, unwrinkled, unblemished, light skin might make you exceptional. It might make you extremely beautiful. But when we talk about royal beauty, especially regarding women, these aesthetic considerations become tightly wound up with political power and legitimacy. And Maria Theresia, the titular king of Hungary and uncrowned empress of Austria, is a great case study for this. She was the most depicted sovereign of her time. She was one of the most famous people in Europe, and she also had a reputation for beauty as a young woman. And this was critical, because as we'll see, she had almost no claim to these lands and titles. By the end of her life, and after having birthed 16 kids, she was obese, neurotic, and housebound. But I think you can still see those signature looks in portraits of her and portraits of her children, including Marie Antoinette. And that's another objection I have. So very often you can see family resemblances across generations. So for example, Augustus the Strong has a very distinct look, and you can see that down the generations to his children, grandchildren, and even great-great-grandchildren. He apparently was supposed to have fathered something like 350 or 360 children during his lifetime. He's crazy. I'll have to make a video about him. The man was notorious. And I think you can also see this in portraits of Margarita von Habsburg and her uncle husband Leopold, who were one of the strangest and actually most successful of the super inbred couples. So I consider family resemblances across generations in these portraits to be a good bit of evidence for their actual faces. I trust that Maria Theresia was as beautiful as she was claimed to be. By the way, I really hate Anglicizations. So up until the 19th century or so, it was common for British people to change the names of foreigners to make them sound more English, which is how you get Maria Theresa rather than Maria Theresia, which is the native German. But you don't do this with French or Italian names, and it just seems very kind of ignorant to me. Like, there's no reason for it. It's not as if these names are any easier. It's just, I think British people in this era were maybe just a little bit xenophobic. I can't give any other logical reason for this. I mean, I understand if it's a Polish name or a Hungarian name, yeah, they're hard. Those are hard names. But German is the easiest language for an English person to learn. It doesn't make any sense. But anyway, Maria Theresia had a very interesting rise to power. Her father had no sons, and instead tried to change the inheritance law in his empire to ensure that his daughter could inherit everything. And they cut out a bunch of cousins to do this. They also played some games to spin Holy Roman Empire law and ensure she got all of his separate territories and their legal claims and their rights within the empire. But that's a separate story. So when she's 23, the father dies, and she inherits the biggest empire in continental Europe, which pisses everybody off. She immediately gets invaded by the French, Prussians, and Bavarians, led by the husband of her cousin, who was cut out of the inheritance by her father. Fortunately for Maria Theresia, these three enemies had separate goals and didn't coordinate very well, and she was able to outmaneuver them and keep most of her territories except for Silesia. We'll get back to this. So even disregarding the old sexist doubts about her ability to rule as a woman, Maria Theresia's core problem was that the legal basis for her rule was essentially non-existent. Women could not inherit under Salic law, which had been the law of the land for over 1,000 years. Her father had no right to cut out all of her husbands and relatives from this inheritance, And neither could she inherit Bohemia's vote in the Holy Roman Empire according to its most essential document, the Golden Bull. None of this mattered, of course, to her soldiers and censors, who enforced her claims and repressed all internal criticism. And she used her Bohemian vote to ensure her husband and later son were elected as Holy Roman Emperors. But it did present a severe challenge to her legitimacy. So at the same time that she's literally fighting for her throne against half of Europe, she needs to begin building a case for her own right to rule. And she does this by becoming the most media-savvy monarch in European history. In 1743, her court scribes published a history of her rule, emphasizing the passionate sympathy felt by her subjects toward her. And in 1745, her newspaper publisher in Prague began to print propagandistic pamphlets, arguing that her right to rule lay in her exceptional sentimentality, which drove all her subjects to love her and shed blood in her defense. This secret propaganda campaign paved the way for her famous political testament of 1749, which was an autobiographical statement of political ideology, and emphasized the claim that her legitimacy as a ruler came from her status as the loving mother of all her subjects. And for the rest of her life, she skillfully used court ritual and special access to her court to encourage book publishers and artists to paint a rosy picture of her and her family. And this reputation still endures today in popular memory in places like Austria and Central Europe. She sat for dozens of official portraits, and the sumptuous rooms she had constructed for her palace in Schönbrunn still stand today as an artistic statement of her sovereignty. But this reputation was entirely crafted and bears little resemblance to reality. Behind the scenes, she was often extremely manipulative and overbearing toward her children, even sending spies to report on her married adult children's behavior in their foreign courts. And though she was always sympathetic toward the plight of famine victims in her empire, the suffering serfs of Hungary and the Poles, she rarely took meaningful action against her aristocracy in ways that would actually make life better for her subjects, even participating half-heartedly in Prussia and Russia's planned partition of Poland in 1772. On the other hand, she did copy, with some success, Prussia's mandatory public education law, though a good 10 years after it was already established in Prussia. But Maria Theresia was the exception, not the rule. And nothing makes this more clear than discovering a historical figure, an early modern king who changed the world so rapidly and so profoundly that he earns the name the Great, but who nevertheless worked his entire life to make sure that no record of his face survives to the present day, except for maybe one. I'm talking about Friedrich II of Prussia, or Frederick the Great to you Anglophones. Was that hard? Was that really so hard? Friedrich. That's right. Every single portrait you've ever seen of old Fritz is a lie. I'm talking about this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. All of them are a lie. So the story goes that Freddie grew up in an extremely traumatic, abusive household. His father was a super physically and emotionally abusive man, extremely harsh. And it didn't help that Friedrich was almost certainly gay and preferred music and literature to his father's militarism. So by the time he inherited the throne, he had become a military genius, but he also had so much generational trauma and daddy issues that he ended up conquering huge chunks of Poland and northern Germany to compensate. When Maria Theresia inherited her lands, he joined the war against her for purely selfish reasons. He wanted and succeeded in conquering the rich province of Silesia, which also sparked a decades-long feud between them. By the skin of his teeth, he managed to overcome multiple massive pan-European coalitions and turn his little polity into one of the great powers of Europe. Oh, by the way, Friedrich was also slightly inbred. His parents were first cousins, his mother's parents were also first cousins, and his grandfathers on both sides of the family were distant relatives. His life is an amazing story, and he's a fascinatingly complex figure. He had a flirtation with Voltaire, played the flute, and composed catty poetry, making fun of the other royal families in Europe. He also had a lifelong feud with Maria Theresia, and even once accused her husband of sending bandits to plot an attack against him. I talk about this more in detail in the other video here. Anyway, throughout his adult life, he consistently and directly refused to sit for an official portrait. He was painted as a child and as a very young adult by his father's court painter, but this was widely believed to have been an idealized image which didn't actually reflect his appearance. He also seems to have hated being forced to sit for hours for these occasions, sometimes up to 4 hours, and the details of his actual appearance are unclear. So when he was a teenager, the English court requested an official portrait as part of setting up an arranged marriage. And his father is said to have replied that they should just paint a large monkey because that's what he looked like. Talk about an abusive man. So it seems likely that he was somewhat insecure about his facial features. Much later in life, he wrote that you have to be an Apollo, Mars, or Adonis to be painted. And because I've never had the honor of being one of these gentlemen, I've withdrawn my face from the painter's brush as much as I could. He was also consistently against depictions of himself in sculpture. So it's an open question why. This reluctance only drove up demand for his image around Europe, and so portraitists invented aesthetically pleasing features for him. They gave him a nice, straight nose, according to the ancient Greek ideal, kind-looking eyes, and a generically pleasant expression. You can see this in his various portraits, which clearly don't even look like they show the same person. And throughout his life, visitors who came to see him, including the young Emperor Joseph II von Habsburg, commented that none of the portraits actually had any resemblance to him. In 1775, Friedrich sent Voltaire this portrait by the artist Anna Dorothea Terbusch, commenting that, in order not to dishonor her brush, she has adorned my contorted face with the grace of youth. Clearly, these paintings had become something of a joke between them. On that note, I'm not actually convinced that this intense reluctance to being painted actually came from insecurity. Most of his comments about this came when he was already a fairly old man. In that same letter to Voltaire, he wrote that his teeth were falling out, he was afflicted by gout, and one girl who saw him in this era commented that his face was leathery, at least by aristocratic European standards, from constant exposure to sun and wind and the elements. By this point, his comments about his appearance are self-deprecating and actually pretty funny. He was a warlord, but he was also witty, musical, funny, and genuinely a sympathetic person. And eventually, these idealized portraits began to develop a sort of symbolic significance, seeking to portray in the king's face a sense of the Spartan Prussian militarism and genius he had become famous for. His eyes became bigger and more piercing, and his mouth more narrow and wrinkled. It's thought that the only accurate image of him made during his lifetime wasn't a portrait at all, but a cartoon of a flutist standing in front of a Greek mythological icon of homosexuality by the English painter William Hogarth. And as a tall, long, gangly dude, I feel like I'm able to say that he looks like a tall, long, gangly, and somewhat bird-like man. And how do we know that this is the most accurate depiction? Because after he died, and when he was no longer able to object, a death mask was made of his face and preserved, and you can see it here. It's amazing. Y'all are going to tear me to shreds in the comments about this, I know. So what do we get from all of this? These two sovereigns are so alike, but also so opposite in really important ways. They both seem to have lived charmed lives. So Maria Theresia had a pampered childhood, but rose to the challenge of her inheritance war by becoming a brilliant manipulator and savvy media strategist. In fact, her tactics were adopted again by the Habsburg monarchy under Emperor Franz Joseph a century later, which began trying to instill personal love of the monarch as a unifying force to tie together their increasingly nationalized subjects. She used her reputation for beauty and her charm to craft a reputation as a beloved motherly monarch, But when we look behind the curtain, we see a woman who was frankly kind of an awful mother, and a staunchly Catholic conservative who was extremely slow and hesitant to introduce social reforms. Freedom of speech was extremely curtailed in her lands, and the authors of newspapers and books critical of her were routinely thrown in prison or sentenced to death in absentia. In fact, the reforms she's usually given credit for, like the abolition of torture in 1776, and the introduction of mandatory public education in 1777, were instituted decades after they had already been adopted by Friedrich in Prussia. In fact, I'd argue that she was only willing to make substantive changes late in life due to growing religious guilt and the pressure of her much more progressive son Joseph. By contrast, Friedrich had an incredibly harsh childhood. When he tried to escape his father when he was 18 and flee to Britain, his father had his lover executed in front of him, and he was imprisoned for about a year. He was also brilliant in his own way, a military genius, an artist who composed over 100 flute sonatas, and an intellectual who corresponded with some of the greatest minds in Europe. Even though he resolutely opposed being painted, his hand could be seen everywhere in his lands. His militarism caused intense suffering, but he was also religiously tolerant, embraced freedom of speech, introduced some legal equality for different classes, and was the first in the world to introduce mandatory public education. He was also an animal lover, and famously introduced potatoes and turnips to improve peasant agriculture. So where Maria Theresia focused on cultivating an image of beauty and motherly love toward her subjects in media, Friedrich actively avoided publicity, but actually made his state much more enlightened and a much better place to live. But one thing that's striking to me about this story is just how willing all of these artists were to fabricate Friedrich's features in his portraits, even without any apparent prompting by the man himself. And they were also unwilling to actually paint an image of the man as he actually was. This was certainly the case for his reputation for flamboyant homosexuality. The king had a falling out with Voltaire in 1753, and after he arrived in Britain, Voltaire authored an anonymous tell-all memoir describing Friedrich's scandalously wild gay liaisons. You can read the details online. If I were to read them to you, I think this video would be demonetized. William Hogarth, the painter who made the cartoon showing the real image of Friedrich, probably got his information about the king from the Prussian artist Georg Friedrich Schmidt, who knew Friedrich directly and may have even had intimate relations with him. And his cartoon is actually chock full of allusions to homosexuality and pederasty. The young man drinks hot cocoa, ignoring his wife's tryst with another man. And there are several visual metaphors in the image to his being cuckolded. Friedrich the flutist stands in front of a mythological painting of Ganymede, a beautiful Greek boy who was abducted and banged by Zeus while in the form of an eagle. This story was a favorite of Freddie, and was added to several of his palaces. And the young man is surrounded by other sexual deviants, an Italian castrato singer, and a cameo of the artist Schmid waving a fan attached to his wrist. So if you imagine yourself as an artist commissioned to paint Maria Theresia, you have a pretty easy job. She and her kids are attractive and photogenic, and you can weave in all sorts of mythological references and symbols into her clothes and background sculpture to make statements about her legitimacy and idealized personal qualities. Her face is fine as it is. You just need to bend the truth about everything else around her. But if you want to paint Friedrich, well, first of all, you can't. He won't sit down for you long enough to get more than just a basic sketch. But then you're faced with a real challenge, which is that the aesthetics of his face and his very simple manner of dress are so barren and iconoclastic that it almost becomes impossible for you to depict him in a light equal to his station. And Lord knows you can't include anything about his commonly known sexual preferences. It's not just that he considered himself ugly. Rather, from the perspective of his portraitists, his sunburnt, malapportioned features were an aberration, and including them accurately would immediately upset the established aesthetic order. And this lasted even after his death mask became common knowledge. Portraits and sculptures continue to be made of him today, which straighten his hooked nose, whiten his skin, and enlarge his piercing eyes. It's like we've all agreed that the lie is more comfortable than the truth. I've said that Friedrich erased his face, and that's not completely true. After his death, artists began to agree upon a defined set of realistic features for him, making him look smaller, slighter, and less classically beautiful, but still with those enormous piercing eyes of imagined genius. And this simple, unconventional, but not ugly face took on a deeper meaning as Germans sought to define for themselves what cultural Prussianness meant. This image is the one that was most enduring, and became iconic in the imperial militarized Germany of the Wilhelmine era. The actor Otto Gebühr famously made a career out of looking a bit like this imaginary face, and he played Freddy on film a dozen times during the 1920s and 30s. It's also worth mentioning that Frederick the Great, as an icon of militarism and, leadership, was a cultural touchstone for the Nazis. So Friedrich's face really did live on, just as a different face than the one he wore in life. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little history detour. If you like my work, you can scan this QR code or click a link down below to find ways to support my work directly. And of course, as always, please like and subscribe to help other people find this content as well. Thanks for watching.